It all started on an ordinary Saturday morning. The kind where you wake up expecting peace, coffee, and a quiet weekend, not chaos from your entitled neighbor's son. I'd been living in this HOA community for nearly 7 years, and while I had my fair share of run-ins with Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, I'd learned to keep my distance. Her rules, her gossip, her constant complaining, I'd heard it all. But this time it wasn't her directly. It was her son, Ethan, a young man in his early 20s who believed the world revolved around him because his mother said so. That morning, I was washing my truck in the driveway, humming to myself, when I noticed Ethan speeding through the cul-de-sac in his new Mustang. He'd been showing it off all week, revving the engine late at night, parking diagonally across 2 spaces near the clubhouse, and even boasting about how his mom bought it outright as a graduation gift. But what he did next crossed every line of decency and common sense. He pulled up right beside my property, music blaring so loud the windows rattled. I ignored it at first. I didn't want to start anything. But when I heard a loud crash, followed by the sound of breaking metal, I ran around to the side of my truck and my jaw dropped. Ethan had slammed into my mailbox post and crushed it flat against the ground. My brand new stainless steel mailbox, one I just installed a month ago, lay twisted and broken in the grass. Ethan stumbled out of the car, looking half annoyed, half embarrassed. "Well, man, that thing came out of nowhere," he said, running his hand through his hair as if the mailbox had jumped into his path. "Came out of nowhere?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's been here for years, Ethan. You were on your phone, weren't you?" He looked away, muttering something under his breath, and I spotted his phone sitting in the driver's seat, screen still lit up from a text thread. Typical. I sighed and pointed to the mess. "You're going to need to pay for that." Ethan gave a laugh, a small mocking one that made my blood pressure rise. "Yeah, I don't think so," he said casually. "My mom's on the HOA board. She'll take care of it." That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be simple. I'd dealt with Karen's arrogance before, but now her son had inherited the same attitude, only worse. I took a deep breath. "Ethan, that's not how this works. You hit my property. You're responsible for the damage. Either pay for it or I'll have to file a report." He smirked. "You can try. But you'll just end up paying for it yourself when the HOA fines you for having a damaged mailbox. That's the rule, right?" I stared at him in disbelief. He wasn't just entitled. He was proud of it. I could practically hear his mother's voice coming out of him. "Fine," I said, keeping my composure. "If that's how you want to handle it, I'll call the police." Ethan's expression changed instantly. "Whoa, hold on," he said, stepping closer. "You don't have to do that. It's just a mailbox." "Yeah," I replied evenly. "And it's my mailbox. You're lucky that's all you hit." As I walked toward my porch to get my phone, Ethan called out, "You'll regret that. My mom knows everyone around here." I didn't even turn back. I'd heard the same empty threat from his mother a dozen times before. I called the non-emergency number, explained the situation, and within 15 minutes, an officer pulled into the neighborhood. The second Ethan saw the police car, his bravado started to fade. He folded his arms, trying to act cool, but the nervous tapping of his foot gave him away. Officer Daniels stepped out, a calm middle-aged man who'd handled nonsense before. "Morning, sir. Heard there was a little accident." "Yeah," I said, pointing at the wrecked mailbox. "This young man ran into my property. He doesn't want to take responsibility." Ethan immediately jumped in. "It wasn't my fault. The mailbox was too close to the street. That's a safety hazard." Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You hit a stationary object on a quiet street, son. I think the hazard here was your driving." Ethan tried to argue, but it was no use. The officer asked for his license and registration, and when he hesitated, Daniels sighed. "Look, Ethan, we can handle this one of 2 ways. You cooperate, or I can file this as property damage and reckless driving. You don't want that on your record." By this point, Karen herself was storming across the street, arms flailing, phone in hand. "What's going on here?" she demanded, glaring at me like I'd just committed a crime. "Your son hit my mailbox," I said. "We're getting it sorted." Karen gasped dramatically, as if the accusation were an insult. "That's ridiculous. Ethan is a careful driver. This must have been your fault somehow. Maybe you put it too close to the road. The officer turned to her calmly. Ma'am, your son admitted to being on his phone. The damage matches his car. It's pretty straightforward. Karen crossed her arms. Well, I'm not paying for it. The HOA will decide what to do. Daniels looked at her evenly. Actually, ma'am, your son is legally responsible. If you choose not to settle this, the homeowner can file a civil claim. But I'm also writing a citation for property damage. You might want to reconsider. Her face froze. The confidence melted away. For a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. But then Ethan muttered, "This is so unfair," and that feeling disappeared entirely. Karen turned to her son. "You're not paying anything, Ethan. He's just trying to make money off us." Daniels let out a quiet sigh. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you stop before I escalate this to reckless endangerment. The damage could have been worse. It's a mailbox today. Next time it could be a person." Karen's lips pressed together. She glanced at her son's car, then at me, and I could see the realization dawn on her. The officer wasn't bluffing. She finally muttered, "Fine. We'll take care of it." The officer nodded, satisfied. He wrote a quick report and handed me a copy. "You'll want this for your records," he said quietly. "If they don't pay within a week, call me back." As they walked away, I caught Ethan's glare, a mix of embarrassment and anger. His pride had taken a hit, and his mother's influence couldn't protect him this time. Later that evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun dip below the trees. I could hear Karen and Ethan arguing faintly from across the street. It was the kind of shouting you hear when someone realizes they're not as untouchable as they thought. I didn't smile, but I'll admit, it felt like justice. For years, she'd pushed everyone around with her authority and entitlement. And now, her own son had learned the hard way that the rules she used to control others applied to her too. When the replacement check arrived in my mailbox a week later, written by Karen herself, it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. For once, accountability had finally shown up in this neighborhood. And for the first time in a long while, I knew that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The following week brought an odd calm to the neighborhood. Karen's house, usually alive with shouting gossip, and the sound of Ethan revving his Mustang, had gone strangely quiet. I didn't see them out front during their usual morning routines. No loud phone calls, no sweeping of an already spotless driveway, and no friendly reminders about HOA guidelines taped to people's doors. It was almost eerie. At first, I figured they were just embarrassed about the whole police incident. After all, it's not every day the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood gets publicly scolded by law enforcement in front of half the cul-de-sac. But I should have known better. Karen never let anything go quietly. By midweek, I found out why. I came home from work one afternoon to see a small yellow notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, an official complaint claiming that my mailbox was improperly installed and obstructing community traffic. I couldn't help but laugh. It was so obviously Karen's doing that she might as well have signed it herself in pink ink. I peeled the notice off and walked straight over to her house. Ethan's Mustang was parked crookedly in the driveway again, bumper still dented from the crash he'd caused. I knocked on the door. A moment later, Karen appeared, her arms crossed, wearing that smug smile I'd come to expect. "Oh," she said sweetly, "I was just about to come talk to you. I noticed your mailbox still hasn't been moved back from the curb." "It hasn't been moved," I said, "because it's in the exact legal position it's supposed to be. I had the city inspector measure it last year when I replaced it." Karen blinked, her expression tightening. "Well, the HOA rules are clear. We can't have things sticking out that close to the street. It could cause accidents." I stared at her for a moment. "You mean like the accident your son caused when he wasn't watching the road?" Her face flushed. "That's not the point. The HOA board will decide." "Funny," I said. "Because I already sent a copy of the police report and your son's citation to the HOA's legal advisor. They'll probably want to double-check the rules before trying to fine me." Karen's jaw tightened. For once, she didn't have a comeback ready. I gave her a polite smile and turned to leave. "Have a nice day, Karen." But this was far from over. The next morning, I noticed Ethan lurking near my property line while I was trimming the hedges. He wasn't doing anything outright wrong. Just standing there, pretending to scroll through his phone while giving me those sideways glares. The kind of look you give someone you think got you into trouble. Finally, I said, "Can I help you with something?" He smirked. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Getting me a ticket? Making my mom look bad." I set down the trimmer. "Ethan, you made yourself look bad. I didn't do anything but tell the truth." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You better watch yourself. People around here don't like snitches." I almost laughed. Snitches? What is this, high school? But the kid was serious. His eyes were full of that same arrogance I'd seen in Karen, but now mixed with something darker, almost resentment. I didn't respond further. I knew better than to escalate things with someone that immature. I turned and went back to my yard work, but I could feel his glare on my back the whole time. Later that night, I went to check my mail and froze. Someone had sprayed a line of mud across the side of my new mailbox. It wasn't much, just enough to send a message. The kind of petty vandalism that screamed, "This isn't over." I took photos, wiped it clean, and didn't say a word. I knew what they were trying to do. Bait me into losing my temper, make me look like the problem. Not this time. A few days later, I noticed something interesting. Officer Daniels, the same cop who handled the original crash, was parked near the neighborhood entrance. When I stopped to talk to him, he smiled knowingly. "Got a few calls from this area," he said. "Someone's been complaining about harassment and unfair treatment." I couldn't help it, I laughed. "Karen." He grinned. "You guessed it. She said the HOA is being targeted by residents who don't respect authority." I told her we'd be happy to review her complaints, especially since her son's case is still open for the damage report. That was the moment I realized the police weren't just humoring her anymore. They were watching. That weekend, the HOA held its monthly meeting at the clubhouse, and you can bet Karen showed up ready for battle. I hadn't planned on attending, but after that bogus notice on my door, I figured I should. When I walked in, the room was packed. A dozen neighbors were seated in the folding chairs, chatting quietly. Karen stood near the front, papers clutched in one hand, her son sitting a few rows back looking bored and restless. As I was saying, Karen announced loudly, "We must maintain our community's appearance. Certain homeowners," she made a not-so-subtle glance toward me, "have installed mailboxes and landscaping features that are not in accordance with HOA standards." I raised my hand. "Would you like to specify which homeowners?" She smiled tightly. "If the shoe fits." I stood up. "Actually, before we go further, I have something to share." I walked to the front and placed a copy of the police report on the table. "This is an official statement from the local department confirming that my mailbox was destroyed by a member of your family, Karen. That means not only was my installation legal, but your son's negligence caused damage to private property." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Karen's face turned crimson. "That's not relevant," she snapped. "We're talking about regulations, not accidents." I didn't back down. "It's completely relevant when you try to weaponize the HOA to punish someone for your own mistakes." One of the board members, Mrs. Lang, cleared her throat. "Karen, is this true?" Karen hesitated, then said, "Well, technically, there was an incident, but—" "Then I suggest," Mrs. Lang interrupted, "we drop this discussion. The mailbox issue is settled." Karen's jaw dropped. Ethan slouched lower in his seat, glaring at me like I'd ruined his life. I didn't stay much longer after that. As I walked out, a few neighbors nodded or gave me quiet smiles. Some even whispered a "good for you." It was the first time I'd seen people stand up to Karen's nonsense. Maybe the tide really was turning. That night, I sat on my porch again, watching the street lights flicker on. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No drama, no threats, no fake notices. Just silence. But I knew Karen. And I knew silence from her wasn't peace. It was planning. She and Ethan weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The next few days were too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you suspicious. I'd grown used to Karen's constant interference in everyone's business and Ethan's immature antics. So when I didn't hear a word, not even a passive-aggressive HOA email or another bogus warning notice, I knew something was brewing. Karen didn't give up. She regrouped. It was early Friday morning when I noticed Ethan again. He was parked near the end of the cul-de-sac, sitting in his Mustang with the engine running, music off for once. It was strange. He wasn't blasting music or showing off like usual. Instead, he just sat there, glaring toward my house. I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became. He wasn't there by coincidence. Around noon, when I came out to take the trash bins to the curb, he started the engine, sped forward, and slammed on the brakes right beside my driveway, leaving tire marks across the asphalt. Then he smirked, rolled down his window, and said, "Watch where you park your trash cans, old man. HOA rules, remember?" I stared at him. "You're really going to keep this up?" He shrugged. "Just giving you a taste of your own medicine. You like calling the cops so much. Maybe they'll fine you this time." Then he revved the engine and sped off laughing. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, and a few blinds shifted as people peeked out to see what was happening. I didn't chase after him. I didn't yell. I just shook my head and went back inside. But that moment told me everything. Ethan wasn't learning a lesson. He was escalating. That evening, I installed a small camera on my porch and another near the mailbox. I wasn't going to let their games continue unchecked. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd protect myself the right way, legally, and with evidence. The next morning, the camera paid off. I woke up to find a fresh set of muddy footprints on my front lawn and a small dent on my mailbox post again. This time, it wasn't crushed, but someone had definitely kicked it hard enough to bend the corner. I checked the footage, and there it was, Ethan, at around midnight, walking up to my mailbox with a smug grin and giving it a solid kick before jogging off. It wasn't rage I felt. It was disappointment. The kid was completely out of control. And his mother, as usual, was nowhere to be found when it came to accountability. So I did what any rational homeowner would do. I forwarded the footage to Officer Daniels. He called me within the hour. "Got the video," he said. "That's definitely Ethan. Same car parked nearby, too. You want to press charges?" I hesitated for a moment. Part of me wanted to let it slide, to just move on. But then I remembered the smugness in his tone, the way he'd said, "old man," and the arrogance in his mother's eyes when she thought the rules didn't apply to her. "Yes," I said finally. "I do." Daniels didn't waste time. That afternoon, his patrol car pulled up to Karen's house. I watched from my porch as Ethan came outside, all cocky smiles and swagger, until Daniels showed him the footage on his tablet. The shift in his expression was priceless. Karen came running out seconds later, bathrobe fluttering, phone in hand. "What is this nonsense? You can't just show up here like this," she snapped. Daniels stayed calm. "Ma'am, your son vandalized private property. We have him on camera. You're lucky the homeowner didn't press for criminal damage. Just a citation." Karen turned to me across the street, her face red with fury. "You really had to involve the police again? Over a scratch?" "It's not about a scratch," I said evenly. "It's about respect, something your son doesn't seem to understand." She scoffed. "You're just jealous because he actually has a nice car and a future ahead of him." Daniels sighed. "Ma'am, if you keep interfering, I'll have to escort you back inside." That shut her up, temporarily at least. Ethan got a citation, and I got another copy of the report. As Daniels drove away, Karen shouted across the street, "You're ruining our lives. You'll regret this." I didn't answer. But inside, I knew this was the final straw. Later that week, things took another strange turn. A few neighbors stopped me during my evening walk. One of them, Mrs. Lang from the HOA board, said, "We've been talking. Karen's been calling every board member trying to start a motion against you. Says you're harassing her family." I sighed. "Let me guess. She left out the part where her son vandalized my property twice?" Mrs. Lang smiled. "Oh, we know. Word's gotten around. People have seen enough to understand what's really going on." That was comforting. For once, people were seeing through her act. For years, Karen had manipulated the board, twisting rules to get her way. But now, her own reputation was collapsing. 2 days later, I came home to find a formal envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a letter from the HOA's legal counsel. It stated that Karen and her son were under investigation for misconduct and harassment toward multiple residents, not just me. Apparently, Ethan had been bothering other neighbors too, keying a car, blocking driveways, and making noise complaints at all hours. The letter also mentioned that the board had suspended Karen's voting privileges pending review. I sat down on my porch, the letter in hand, and couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. Justice, it seemed, had a funny way of catching up. But I wasn't celebrating just yet. Because deep down, I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. When someone like her feels cornered, they lash out, and sure enough, the next evening proved me right. I was making dinner when I heard shouting outside. I stepped onto the porch and saw Karen standing in the middle of the street, phone in one hand, screaming into the air. "This is harassment," she yelled. "He's stalking my family. I'm calling the police." Ethan stood behind her, arms crossed, trying to look tough but clearly embarrassed. A few neighbors peeked out from their windows, phones ready. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up. Daniel's was in one of them. When he stepped out, Karen immediately pointed at me. "That's him. He's spying on us. He's recording my son without permission." Daniels raised a brow. "You mean the same son we caught vandalizing his property on video? The same footage you refused to dispute last week?" Karen froze. She hadn't expected that. He continued. "Ma'am, if you keep making false reports, you'll be facing consequences of your own. You might want to stop before this gets worse." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned around and stormed back toward her house, dragging Ethan by the arm. The crowd slowly dispersed. Daniels walked over and said quietly, "Don't worry. I've filed everything. If they bother you again, we'll escalate it." "Thanks, officer," I said. "I just want peace." "I know," he replied. "And trust me, they're running out of rope." That night, for the first time in months, I slept soundly. The fear, the frustration, it all faded a little. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I did know this: Karen and her son had finally been shown that the rules apply to everyone. Even them. The following week marked a turning point in our little neighborhood war. For the first time in years, Karen and Ethan's house sat silent. No blaring music, no slammed doors, no self-righteous speeches about HOA rules echoing down the street. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind through the trees. It felt peaceful. But peace with Karen was never permanent. It was a pause before her next performance. That Friday, I received an unexpected knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Mrs. Lang, the HOA vice president, standing there with a folder in her hands and an apologetic smile. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" she asked politely. I invited her in and offered her a seat. She set the folder down on my coffee table. "I wanted to talk to you privately before next week's meeting," she began. "We've decided to remove Karen from the HOA board permanently." I blinked, surprised but not exactly disappointed. "Permanently?" She nodded. "Yes. We've had multiple complaints about her abusing her position, manipulating citations, singling out homeowners, even intimidating a few families into paying unnecessary fees. And after what happened with her son, we can't have her representing the board anymore." I leaned back, a slow smile forming. "That's long overdue." Mrs. Lang smiled back. "You're not the only one who feels that way. Truth is, most of us were too afraid to speak up before. But after everything that happened, and that video of Ethan vandalizing your property, people started talking. They're tired of being pushed around." It was strange, hearing those words. For years, Karen had ruled the neighborhood like a petty tyrant, and everyone had gone along with it just to avoid conflict. But now her power was gone, undone by her own arrogance and her son's recklessness. After Mrs. Lang left, I stood on my porch and looked across the street at Karen's house. The blinds were drawn tight. Ethan's Mustang sat motionless in the driveway, collecting dust. For the first time, I felt something close to sympathy. Not forgiveness, but a faint understanding. People like Karen spent so long pretending to have control that they forgot how to live without it. The following Tuesday was the official HOA meeting. The air in the clubhouse was tense. Everyone knew what the meeting was about, and everyone wanted to see the outcome for themselves. When Karen entered, she looked nothing like the confident woman who used to command every room. She kept her sunglasses on, shoulders stiff, Ethan trailing a few steps behind her, hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets. Mrs. Lang called the meeting to order. Today's agenda involves the vote to remove a board member due to repeated violations of HOA bylaws and misconduct. Karen shot to her feet. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped. "You're all just jealous that I actually enforce the rules around here." Mrs. Lang stayed calm. "Karen, you've been given every opportunity to explain yourself. But the evidence speaks for itself, including your son's vandalism and your repeated attempts to misuse your position against residents." Karen glared around the room. "You people are unbelievable. After everything I've done to keep this neighborhood in order." A voice interrupted from the back. It was Mr. Patel, one of the oldest residents on the block. "What you've done," he said sternly, "is make people miserable. You fined me for having flowers that were too bright. You told my wife her garden looked unprofessional. You called the cops on teenagers for selling lemonade. This isn't order, Karen. It's control." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Karen's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing with no words coming out. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly wishing he could disappear. Mrs. Lang cleared her throat. "All in favor of removal?" Every hand in the room went up. Every single one. Even a few of Karen's old allies who'd once supported her. Her jaw dropped. "You can't be serious," she cried. "You can't do this to me." Mrs. Lang gave a simple, firm nod. "It's done. Effective immediately." Karen stood frozen for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. Enjoy your little neighborhood without me. But don't come running when it all falls apart." She turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Ethan followed, head low, not saying a word. For the first time in a long time, the room felt lighter, as if the neighborhood had collectively exhaled. After the meeting, several neighbors came over to thank me. "You stood up when no one else would," one woman said. "You started the change." I didn't feel like a hero. I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I just refused to be bullied, and that had been enough to show others they could do the same. Over the next few weeks, life in the neighborhood transformed. People smiled more. Kids played outside without being scolded for noise violations. The HOA actually started using its funds for improvements instead of arbitrary fines. For once, it felt like a community, not a dictatorship. As for Karen and Ethan, they kept mostly to themselves after that. I saw her once or twice, walking to her car with her head down, avoiding eye contact. Ethan's Mustang eventually disappeared from the driveway, and rumor had it he'd moved out after another brush with the law involving reckless driving. It was poetic in a way. The same arrogance that had fueled their downfall followed them beyond our neighborhood. One quiet evening, about a month later, I sat on my porch again with my usual cup of coffee. The air was crisp, the streetlights soft. For the first time since all this began, I felt genuine peace. Mrs. Lang walked by with her dog and waved. "How's the mailbox holding up?" she teased. I chuckled. "Still standing strong." "Well," she said with a grin, "that thing's practically a symbol now. The whole block's been talking about how it survived the Karens." We both laughed, and after she left, I looked at that mailbox, the one Ethan had smashed, kicked, and tried to destroy. Somehow, it had become more than just metal and bolts. It was a reminder that some people will always test your patience, but standing your ground matters. You don't fight arrogance with anger. You fight it with truth, calm, and a little persistence. And in the end, it wasn't just about a broken mailbox. It was about a neighborhood learning that entitlement only wins if you let it. That night, as I turned off the porch light and stepped inside, I caught one last glimpse of Karen's darkened house across the street. For the first time, it looked small, not because it had changed, but because the power she once had was gone. Maybe she'd finally realized what the rest of us already knew. Rules aren't meant to protect egos, they're meant to protect people. And as far as I was concerned, justice had finally done its job.